The morning Diane Mercer officially took over as regional director of Northern Crest Health Network, she found a man asleep in the server room with his head resting on a folded jacket on top of a keyboard tray, surrounded by a wall of monitors running logs that scrolled faster than most people could read. She did not try to read them. She looked at the man, looked at his badge, and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. By the time the morning shift had finished its first round of coffee, Callum Reed had been escorted from the building with his access card sitting in a manila envelope on the security desk. 6 hours later, the hospital's patient monitoring network began going dark, unit by unit, floor by floor, in a silence so clean and so fast that it took the on-call technicians almost 12 minutes to understand what they were actually looking at. Northern Crest Regional in Sudbury was not a small community clinic where a slow afternoon might mean a backed-up waiting room. It was a 340-bed acute care facility handling cardiac monitoring, surgical recovery, and a 12-bed intensive care unit that operated around the clock without pause. The systems that ran the building were not a background convenience. They were load-bearing infrastructure, the kind that kept medication dispensing synchronized, patient records accessible across departments, and the monitoring feeds from ICU beds flowing continuously to the nursing stations responsible for watching them. A failure in that environment did not mean inconvenience. It meant a nurse on the overnight shift staring at a blank screen above a bed where something might be going wrong, with no automated alert to tell her which bed it was. Callum Reed was 47 years old and had been with Northern Crest for 11 years, which made him one of the longest-serving members of the technical operations team by a significant margin. He was not the kind of person who announced that fact. He wore the same type of gray fleece most days, kept a handwritten notebook in his back pocket rather than a phone, and had a habit of arriving earlier than anyone asked him to and leaving later than anyone noticed. New employees sometimes mistook him for a contractor or a maintenance tech because he never corrected the impression. The people who had worked alongside him long enough had learned to understand what his presence in a particular corridor actually meant. Callum had been a widower for 5 years. His wife, Janet, had died from an aggressive form of ovarian cancer that had moved faster than any of them had been prepared for. What he had left behind was a 9-year-old son named Sam, who was quiet in the deliberate way of children who have processed more grief than their age suggests, and who had developed a habit of leaving small handwritten notes in his father's lunch bag. The notes were usually observations about things Sam had noticed that day, sometimes a joke he had read somewhere and saved for later. Callum had kept every one of them, folded and stacked in the drawer of the nightstand on his side of the bed. His life had organized itself around 2 things after Janet died: keeping Sam steady and keeping the job that paid for the house, the medication Sam needed for his type 1 diabetes, and the after-school care that let Callum stay at Northern Crest through the longer shifts. He did not cultivate close friendships at work. He did not know how to make himself visible to people whose approval might have mattered. He showed up, he solved problems, he went home. On the other side of the building's hierarchy, recently arrived from a regional health authority restructuring in southern Ontario, was Diane Mercer. She was 38, credentialed out of Waterloo and the Schulich School of Business, and had spent the previous 6 years managing operational efficiency reviews across a cluster of mid-sized Ontario hospitals that had been quietly hemorrhaging resources for years. She was sharp, methodical, and deeply serious about accountability. She had been brought to Northern Crest specifically because the board wanted someone who would not be softened by the organization's existing culture into tolerating the things that needed to change. What she had not had time to develop was a working knowledge of what the operational infrastructure at Northern Crest actually looked like underneath the surface. She had the org charts. She had the budget summaries. She had not yet had the conversation with anyone who could have told her what the systems were actually doing, and why, and who was the reason they were still doing it. 3 days before the morning that would change everything, Callum noticed something he was not supposed to notice. He had been reviewing access logs from the remote monitoring relay that handled the overnight data feeds from ICU equipment to the central nursing station. It was a narrow function system, inherited from a previous vendor contract and never fully modernized, that most of his colleagues treated as background infrastructure. Callum checked it more often than the job required because he had a long memory for how quietly things could go wrong in systems nobody was watching. The anomaly was small, a cluster of authentication requests appearing at irregular intervals, originating from a device address that did not match any registered internal hardware. The requests were not aggressive, they were not triggering any automated alerts. They were patient, spaced out, mimicking the rhythm of standard maintenance traffic with enough accuracy that the automated systems had flagged nothing. But the pattern was wrong. Not in a way that was easy to explain immediately, but in a way that Callum had learned to trust over 11 years of watching infrastructure behave. He traced the activity and found a foothold. Someone had obtained access to a low-priority relay node that sat at the edge of the hospital's network, a piece of equipment that managed a subset of the building's environmental and equipment monitoring feeds. From that position, they had been quietly testing what they could reach. The probe had been running for at least 4 days before Callum saw it, mapping the architecture, identifying which systems were linked to which, learning where the connections ran. He brought it to his direct supervisor, a man named Doug Price, who had been managing the technical operations team for 3 years, and who was acutely aware of how badly timed a major security incident would be during a directorial transition. Price asked Callum to document what he had found and continue monitoring. He used the word escalate, but in a context that communicated the opposite. Callum did not wait. He began constructing manual containment barriers around the segments of the network he had identified as compromised, redirecting suspicious traffic into isolated observation queues where it could not reach the systems it appeared to be targeting. The problem was that the architecture he was working with had been built in layers over more than a decade, each addition grafted onto what existed before, held together by workarounds that had become load-bearing walls over time. He could not take any significant portion of it offline to clean it properly. The ICU monitoring feeds were live, the medication dispensing systems were active, the patient record infrastructure was in continuous use. Taking anything down cleanly was not an option. Working around it, inside it without disturbing what was running was the only path available. What followed was not a sprint. It was the kind of sustained technical endurance that most people who have not done it cannot picture. Callum worked through the first night without sleeping, ate from the vending machines near the stairwell, and changed his shirt in the staff bathroom on the second floor sometime after 1 in the morning. The operations team members who crossed paths with him assumed he was managing a routine escalation. Nobody understood the actual scale of what he was doing because Callum was not in the habit of narrating his work while he was doing it. On the second night, he found something that moved the situation past serious into something that required a different word. The intrusion had embedded a delayed trigger inside the patient monitoring relay. It was designed to stay invisible during normal operations. If anyone performed a standard system reboot, the kind used regularly to clear memory accumulation and resynchronize services, a procedure so routine the technical team had a checklist for it, the trigger would fire. The containment logic Callum had built would collapse. The dormant pathway would open. And the attacker, who had been patient for 4 days and had learned the system well, would be in a position to encrypt the patient monitoring database, disable the ICU feeds, and deliver a ransom demand to a hospital in the middle of a clinical day. Callum wrote it all down. He built a file. Time-stamped log summaries, containment patch annotations, a plain explanation of the trigger mechanism and what would activate it, and an explicit list of what not to do and why. He intended to walk that file to executive leadership in the morning and stay in the room until someone understood it. But the body has its own accounting, and Callum had been running his at a deficit for nearly 2 full days. Sitting in the server room waiting for the morning shift to arrive, he put his head down for 1 moment. He did not come back up. Diane arrived at 7:30 for what she had organized as an unannounced walkthrough of the hospital's operational support areas. She wanted to see how the building actually functioned before the formal briefings her department heads were preparing for her. She moved through the building with a quiet efficiency, asking brief questions, observing, not yet requiring answers to everything. She found the server room on the basement level. The door was propped. Inside, a man in a gray fleece was asleep at the primary workstation, his head resting on a folded jacket across the edge of the desk. The monitors around him were running, log output scrolled. Status indicators blinked amber in a pattern that would have meant something specific to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Diane was not yet that person. What she saw was a symbol, a member of the technical operations team asleep at the most sensitive workstation in the hospital's infrastructure, in the first week of a new directorship. It confirmed something she had already half suspected about the culture she was inheriting. That comfort had replaced accountability so thoroughly that people could fall asleep on the job, and nobody had thought to mention it. She read his badge. She said his name clearly enough that 2 other staff members in the corridor outside the open door heard it. Callum surfaced from sleep in the disoriented, heavy-limbed way of someone pulled back from something deep before the body was ready. His eyes were dry and painful. His ears rang. He registered the room, the monitors, the woman standing in the doorway, and then recognized her face from the announcement photo that had gone around 2 days before. He spoke before she could continue. "You need to see the documentation I've built on the monitoring relay. There's an active intrusion and there's a trigger in the system that Diane cut across him with the flat certainty of someone who has already made a decision. I don't think this is how we start the morning. She turned to the security officer who had appeared at her shoulder. Please collect his badge. HR will initiate the formal process. Callum looked at her. He was not panicked. He was carrying the specific urgency of someone watching a preventable disaster on approach and understanding exactly how much time remains. He tried once more. If anyone runs the standard system reboot, that's enough. She had already moved her attention to the security officer. Callum handed over his badge without argument. He did not raise his voice. He did not recite what he had spent 2 days doing. A younger technician named Joel was standing near the door, someone Callum had trained 2 years earlier, and Callum looked at him directly and said it clearly enough to be heard by the 3 people nearest to him. Do not reboot the monitoring relay. Do not touch it. The checklist restart will trigger the attack. Joel nodded once, barely the nod of a person registering information they are not yet sure what to do with. Callum picked up his jacket from the desk. He looked at the monitors for 1 more second, then he walked out. He reached his car in the hospital's employee parking structure and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before he started it. He had not been given a single complete sentence to explain what he knew. He did not know whether the warning he had managed to leave behind would be enough. He drove home in the early morning light with the particular emptiness of someone who has given everything they had and is no longer sure if it mattered. Sam was at school. A neighbor's daughter, Tanya, was coming at 4 to stay until Callum could arrange something more permanent, which now had a different urgency than it had 24 hours ago. The apartment was quiet and organized in the way of a home run by someone who did not have time for disorder. Callum sat on the edge of Sam's bed for a moment, looking at the small stack of books on the nightstand, the inhaler clipped to the headboard in arm's reach, and then he went to the couch and did not take off his jacket before he was asleep. Back at Northern Crest, the morning continued. The patient monitoring systems ran, the ICU feeds flowed. The containment logic Callum had built overnight was doing its work in silence, absorbing the irregular traffic, keeping the compromised relay isolated in a way that was completely invisible unless you understood what you were looking at. To the supervisors joining Diane for her morning briefings, the building functioning normally in Callum's absence confirmed the logic of the decision. If the systems were fine, there had been nothing urgent to begin with. In the technical operations room, the atmosphere was different. Several members of the team had found the documentation folder Callum had been maintaining and had opened it. The files were dense, written in the compressed technical shorthand of someone working at speed without opportunity for revision. There were containment patch references, log analysis fragments, and a set of explicit warnings that stood out even to the team members who did not fully understand the context. Nobody had the complete picture. Each person had a piece, and the pieces did not yet form something actionable enough to bring upstairs. Joel did not say what Callum had told him to anyone who had the authority to act on it. Shortly before 11, the on-duty operations supervisor, a capable and well-meaning technician named Bryce Halloran, noticed elevated memory usage in the patient monitoring relay and performance lag across 2 of its connected services. The lag was minor. The pattern matched the kind of low-level congestion that a standard service restart resolved reliably. He had run that restart dozens of times. He opened the checklist. From across the room, Joel looked up. His mouth opened and then did not produce a word. He was 26 years old, and 2 years into his first technical operations role, and the regional director had escorted the person who told him not to do this out of the building 4 hours ago. The institutional gravity of that fact pressed down on whatever he had been about to say until it was gone. Bryce ran the restart. Callum woke to his phone vibrating on the cushion beside his face. He looked at the screen. 6 missed calls, 3 from numbers he recognized as internal Northern Crest extensions, 2 from the main switchboard. He checked the time. It was 11:43 in the morning. He did not need to open any of the voicemails to understand what had happened. He had known it was possible. He had been hoping, in the way that exhausted people hope, that it would not be. He sat up, pulled the monitoring application from his laptop. The remote access was active because the badge revocation had been processed administratively, but the system credentials had not yet been manually disabled, and looked at the numbers. The authentication tokens had gone asynchronous across 3 services, the containment barriers were gone, the relay was open, outbound connections were forming to addresses outside the hospital's verified network. He was looking at the first minutes of an active ransomware deployment. He set the laptop down and looked at the room, at the stack of Sam's school books on the kitchen counter. At the lunch bag packed the night before, Sam's handwriting visible through the clear pocket on the front where he sometimes tucked the notes before his father even had a chance to look. He thought about what Diane had done and about the 12 engineers in the building right now who were about to discover that the situation was beyond what any of them had encountered before, and about the nurses on the ICU floor who would eventually look up at their monitoring screens and find them blank. He picked up his phone. He called the main technical operations line. It connected in under a second. What? The voice on the other end didn't wait for him to introduce himself. Callum, it's Bryce. I don't know how much you know. I know what happened, Callum said. I need remote full access credentials reinstated, and I need them in the next 4 minutes or the authentication layer locks out permanently. There was a pause of approximately 3 seconds. Then Bryce said hold on and did not set the phone down. The credentials came through in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Callum worked from the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees. He mapped the active outbound connections and began redirecting the ones already formed into isolated observation endpoints where they could not reach the encryption trigger. He communicated by phone with Bryce and with 2 other technicians who were stationed at different parts of the building's network infrastructure, directing them in specific, precise language to the actions that would take too long to explain from the beginning and that he needed executed immediately without the full explanation. What he was doing was not clean. It was improvised under conditions that made clean impossible, building on the containment logic he had already constructed and adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated while he was asleep. But he knew this system the way a person knows a road they have driven 10,000 times. Not just how it was designed to run, but how it had evolved over 11 years of partial upgrades and emergency patches into something different from the design, and what that evolution meant under the specific stress of what was happening right now. 37 minutes after the credentials were reinstated, the active outbound connections were severed, the authentication layer was stabilized. The ransomware's encryption trigger had not fired, the patient monitoring feeds were still running, the ICU screens had not gone dark, there were losses. 2 departments had sustained data access interruptions that would require manual recovery. The security audit that followed would be extensive and expensive. But the thing that Callum had been working for 2 days to prevent, a full encryption event locking clinical staff out of patient records and monitoring systems in the middle of a clinical day with a ransom demand arriving while the ICU ran on contingency protocols, had not happened. He set the laptop down and sat for a long time in the silence of the apartment. Then he got up and washed his face and started thinking about what Sam was going to need for dinner. He was standing in front of the open refrigerator when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered because he had been doing that all day. The voice was Diane's. I need to tell you something, she said, and then did not say anything for a moment. I made a decision this morning that I made too quickly and without the information I needed. I am sorry for that. The people here have been explaining to me what you were doing when I found you. I should have asked before I acted. Callum stood with the refrigerator still open, feeling the cold air on his forearm. He did not say anything immediately. Diane continued because stopping was not an option. Our security team is requesting you come back, not to ask you a favor, because you are the only person who fully understands what happened and what it did to the infrastructure. Callum closed the refrigerator. Sam gets home at 4. We can have someone to your address within the hour if that helps. My neighbor's daughter is coming. I'll come when Sam is home and settled and has eaten something. He paused, and I'm not coming in through the front entrance. There was a short silence. I'll make sure of it. He arrived at the hospital at 5:30. He had taken time to eat something himself, change his shirt for the 3rd time in 2 days, and sit with Sam for 20 minutes at the kitchen table while Sam described a disagreement that had happened at lunch over which province had the best hockey history, a topic Sam had opinions about. Callum listened with full attention. Sam was 10 years old and already understood, without anyone having explained it to him, that sometimes his father came home carrying weight from somewhere else, and that the right thing to do was to talk about something ordinary until the weight settled. When Callum arrived at the hospital, he entered through the loading bay on the east side, where Bryce was waiting with a temporary access card. The walk from the bay to the Technical Operations Center took 4 minutes. By the time Callum arrived at the workstation, the room had the particular quality of a group of people who have been managing something beyond their capacity and have just seen the person with the relevant capability come back through the door. He sat down, pulled up the current system state, and did not speak for approximately 90 seconds. Then he began directing the recovery. He assigned specific tasks to 6 people, each one targeted and unambiguous. He explained to 2 engineers exactly why the containment barriers had to be rebuilt in a specific order rather than the faster but structurally unsound order they had attempted. He asked someone from administration to prepare a plain language communication for department heads, explaining the service interruption and what the current status was, in language that was accurate without being technical enough to generate questions that couldn't be answered quickly. The formal recovery took 3 hours. By 9 in the evening, the full patient monitoring network had been tested and verified, all active outbound anomalies had been closed, and the architectural documentation that Callum had been building in real time for 2 days had been transferred into a shared repository with enough annotation that a technically competent person who had not been present could follow what had happened and why each decision had been made. The meeting that followed involved Diane, the board's operations liaison, the CTO of the health authority, and a group of department heads. The incident report was clear. Callum had identified the intrusion first, he had reported it and been asked to wait. He had worked for 52 hours to prevent a catastrophic clinical event. He had been removed from the building before he could brief incoming leadership. His warning had been dismissed. The standard restart had been executed, and the result had been exactly what he predicted. The only reason the outcome had not been worse was that he had continued working remotely, without formal authorization from his apartment couch, with credentials that should have been revoked already but had not been. Several people in the room reached for the language that organizations produce when they need to distribute responsibility broadly enough that nothing lands too squarely on anyone in particular. Diane did not reach for it. She said what she had done and what it had nearly cost, and she said it plainly in front of everyone present, without qualification or the softening language she had used in other difficult rooms. It was not a performance. It was the specific discomfort of a person who has understood exactly how wrong they were and has decided that the only honest response to that is to say it out loud. Callum, seated at the far end of the table, received it with a quiet nod. He did not perform forgiveness. He did not produce the warm resolution the moment seemed to call for. He was too tired for theater and too honest to pretend. In the weeks that followed, Callum was offered a great deal, a new title, a compensation adjustment that was significant, a restructured role with the kind of organizational authority his experience had always warranted. These were offered quickly and without negotiation, in the way that institutions move when they understand how narrowly they have avoided something they do not want to contemplate. What Callum negotiated first was not any of those things. He asked for a formal escalation protocol guaranteeing that any technical operations staff member could bring a security concern directly to executive leadership when a supervisor had declined to act on it, with written acknowledgement required within 4 hours. He asked for shift rotation standards in the operations center, preventing any single person from being on continuous coverage for more than 16 hours without a documented handoff. He asked for a policy that explicitly protected any staff member who raised a risk alarm from professional penalty, regardless of whether the alarm turned out to be correct. He presented these to the board's operations liaison with the calm of someone who understood exactly what leverage he was sitting on and had decided how to use it. The liaison looked at the document, then he looked at Callum. "You could have asked for a lot more. These are what matters," Callum said. Diane accepted every item without amendment. The change that followed in how she led the organization was not visible in any policy document. It was visible in how she moved through the building. She arrived in departments without an agenda. She asked questions that were genuinely questions, not assessments in disguise. She learned to identify the difference, which she had not been able to do before, between the people who were loudest about their work and the people who were quietly holding something essential together. It was a skill she had paid an enormous amount to acquire, and she did not forget what it had cost. Several weeks after the incident had been formally closed, Callum was in the hospital lobby at the end of a late shift, Sam beside him with a backpack slung over one shoulder, having been brought over by Tanya after a school event that had run long. Sam was in the middle of an elaborate account of something that had happened involving a substitute teacher and a projector that would not work, and Callum was giving it the same complete attention he gave technical problems, which was his only mode. Diane came through the lobby from the direction of the administrative wing and stopped when she saw them. She had been thinking, for several weeks, about what to say to Callum that was not professional and not administrative and not an extension of the apology she had already made. She had not found the words because the right words for something like this are not the kind a person assembles in advance. She walked over and said hello to Sam first because that was the right thing to do, and Sam assessed her with the same quiet directness he applied to everything and apparently decided she was acceptable. She handed Callum an envelope. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten, that she had written 3 times before she had written a version that felt honest enough to give to someone who deserved honesty more than most people she had met. It was not a professional letter. It was not a reference or a commendation or a formal acknowledgement. It was a reckoning, put on paper by a person who had looked at what she had nearly destroyed and needed to name it to the person who had been standing in the middle of it. Callum read the first paragraph there in the lobby and then folded it and put it in his jacket pocket to read the rest of it later, when Sam was asleep and the apartment was quiet. Sam had already moved on from the substitute teacher story and was asking whether they could stop at the Tim Hortons on the drive home because he had been thinking about a Boston cream all afternoon. Callum looked at Diane once more, and what passed between them was not warm in any performed way and was not resolved in any clean way, but it was honest, which was more than either of them had managed on the morning this had started, and more than many people in this kind of situation ever arrived at. He told Sam yes about the Tim Hortons. They walked out through the lobby's sliding doors into the particular cold of a Sudbury evening in early November. The parking lot lit amber under the lot lights, the sky overhead the deep blue of a clear night just past dusk, and for the few minutes it took to reach the car, with Sam talking about hockey again and the breath visible in the cold air, Callum Reed was not a man carrying the weight of what had almost happened. He was a father at the end of a long week, walking his son to the car, in a city that was ordinary and lit and alive around him, and that was more than enough.